A wee bit about me. I grew up in a Reformed Jewish congregation, but did not have a bar mitzvah. I studied many faith traditions throughout my life. I'm a deep creative in words, in art, and even user interfaces for software. I enjoy puzzles, deep thoughts, and long hugs. On April 27th, 37 years ago, I delivered an adult bar mitzvah sermon I wrote. The sermon today is in an abridged and slightly updated version of the original. The sections regarding to Judaism has been removed due to time constraints. If you want a copy of the original sermon, please let me know. In 1985, it was rare for a disabled Jew to not only give a sermon, but to chant the Hebrew and translate it. Back then, ADA was just a dream and an ordeal for ramps, and mass media representation was a joke. Interpreters for worship and jobs was unheard of. The independent living movement was underway and wrestling with society. Jacob's story of wrestling will be understood on the spiritual and personal levels which reflect my life story. Jacob chose to be alone, to be left alone, not to hold back oneself by protecting one's social status or cherished possessions, prepares one for crossing life's ambiguous crisis. Is there a sacrificial movement being required? Yes. For change engages often those who are threatened and protected by solitude. Solitude prepares one for transforming growth, but solitude often requires one to wrestle completely alone, though seeking help will not diminish one's growth that's sought for. To contend alone is often a part of mastering one's disabilities, so disabled persons must contend with solitude, either inflicted upon them or sought after by them. They must learn how solitude can prepare them for growth. Growth in not being merely disabled, but embracing they are fully differently abled. They struggle never to become lost in society's punishing silence or loneliness. In the biblical story, Jacob wrestles, as do we. Accidental or deliberate, his life's presences contend with oneself. In the still of a moment, a self-image or worldview is painfully strained, wrenched even, and encountering an elusive presence. Suddenly, a person's cherished visions, the protected visions, are ruthlessly challenged. But with persistence and fortitude, the person can creatively defend, rediscover, or reclaim their visions for newer insights. But whom does the differently able contend with? Themselves, yes, but much more. They contend with the oppressive mass media models of what being human is supposed to look like and act like. The differently abled often have to twist, reshape, and to smash these toxic models. Yes, there have been recent improvements, such as TV shows and movies showing first steps of inclusive representation. However, the daring claim is still needed. I am a complete human, truly a visionary claim for all. Jacob's wrestling is stressful, contending with a presence. However blissful or terrible, the contending presence must eventually leave so the person can continue growing. If blissful, the presence leaves to prevent inattentional manipulation or unsavory control. If terrible, the presence leaves to prevent an unnecessary martyr fixation from occurring. But from both modes, the presence can only leave if the person but for both modes, the presence can only leave if the person lets go. Hence, Jacob's our plea for a blessing. Can a blessing be found and claimed from these encounters? Yes, one can. Often, to allow maturing growth, the differently able must learn to let go with self-imposed limitations and transcend limitations imposed by others. To release and transcend limitations requires the differently able to demand much of themselves and of others. But after the struggle, the differently able can become fully capable in their own way. Jacob's name shift is very important. Sometimes one has to ask yourself or be asked, who are you? One can claim overreacher or opportunist, or one can claim being an overpowerer, but that is arrogant. Better yet, one can seek a renaming shift to transform the self appraisal, a shift offering growth from being merely an overpowerer to being a God striver. This renaming shift for growth is a renewal and a redeeming deed. Here, the old name is not removed, but added to, for blessing often comes from reclaiming the old name and claiming the new name together. And an affirming renaming for the differently abled, none. For society often prefers to misname through harmful nicknames, spaz, retard, cripple. These echo in our souls for years to come. Even the legal terms legally blind or disabled has a traumatic effect. The differently abled ask, why use these wrenching names? Whose identity is being preserved or strained? Thus, the differently abled becomes a people striver to reclaim their human rights as whole persons. Jacob seeks a name. Offering a name is an ambiguous deed, for a name can either restrict or liberate a hard-won insight about a person's character. The earlier renaming freed one from being an overpowerer to becoming a responsible God striver. Yet, typically, one responds to this renaming as an overpowerer by overreaching. How? Through a restricting demand to reduce the elusive presence into human categories. Thankfully, the presence will gently defer such an unseemly request. The requests made by the differently abled for equal opportunities appear often as inconvenient, even by some considered entitlement. These requests for accessibility are quite obvious and needed. Deaf signers, digital readers, and talking street signs. Straightforward solutions, and now there are many offered. But granted, there are still awkward requests, rides for dates, typing notes from books, or borrowing another's eyes for shopping. As for relationships, not to rely on gender assumptions, but to offer to listen and learn, ask many questions to understand better. However, these requests, these yearnings can be satisfied, even becoming appropriate and appropriated by society. The presence leaves. To encounter a terrible or even blissful presence face to face can be maiming. Yes, bliss and stress does not last forever. Yet that maiming can be a preserving deed. That this is the requested blessing to survive encountering the illusion's presence, or that each wrestling with oneself or another does have a releasing dawn. But however insightful the wrestling, there will always be a relentless reminder that encounter. Though strange to the able-bodied, the differently abled strive to reclaim or rename the harmful metaphors as a prompting force. Hence, for some differently able, their disabilities have become a blessing. Why? Because being maimed reminds the person that life is short and frail. And thus one learns to say the chayim to life often, because being maimed puts life into perspective, ruthlessly evaluating the common pettiness and immature misunderstandings between people, thus sorting out one's priorities. In the end, the differently able can not only live, but thrive. The Yabok crossing is now complete by retelling Jacob's story. But retelling requires much. One must allow the story to wrestle with oneself. And what are some of the possible blessings from that wrestling? That the differently able prophetically remind society of the general human condition. And society can gain a blessing from wrestling with the differently able. In Elie Wiesel's novel, The Oath, A deep challenge, paraphrased by me, was offered. So you want to be an UU, find or even claim you are UU. Well, what are you going to do about it? Just saying you're an UU or being born an UU is not enough. What will you give? What will you do? Thank you.